Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Mess. So Tarek and I might be using the structure and title cards of our MiSTer FPGA series. We're doing something a little bit different today. We're looking towards the future about FPGAs on the horizon and what sort of systems they could possibly run. Because I keep getting comments asking about when the next generation of FPGA chips is going to be here and when you can play GameCube, PlayStation 2, and Xbox on them. Now I am not here to pour water on the spark, which is the excitement of FPGA technology as far as it comes to retro gaming. I am here to kind of talk about what it would actually entail to have a GameCube, PlayStation 2, or Xbox core, and whether or not those would actually even be necessary at this point in time, because I understand you think new generation of FPGA hardware, new generation of consoles beyond the Nintendo 64, PlayStation 1, and Sega Saturn, but it's not really like that. I mean, I get it. There's a metric crap ton of amazing games on PlayStation 2 that everyone would probably love to play on an FPGA device. The same thing goes for the Xbox, maybe not the deepest library, but these were fondly remembered consoles from back in the day, and now that FPGAs are being used to recreate hardware for the retro gaming space, people want their favorite systems to come over to them. Or something like GameCube. Obviously, a Nintendo hit, didn't sell well, but people still love it, and everyone wants to know when it's going to come over. And I think this is all down to the fact that people have been really talking about the Nintendo 64 core and how that seemed to be impossible. So now everyone thinks that everything is possible just given the right hardware and the right amount of time. Because people look at Robert's or FPGAZumSpass's Nintendo 64 core and they say, somebody created 99% of a Nintendo 64 on MiSTer FPGA in a year. He just finished development as of the recording of this voiceover, and it took 1 calendar year to get that done. Or you take a look at SRG 320 and a Sega Saturn core, that's going on year 2 now. Granted, he did live in Ukraine and didn't have the freedom to work at the same pace that Robert would, but it still takes 1 year to 2 years to get these cores to the point in time in which they are. So you have to think to yourself, how much more complex are GameCube, PlayStation 2, and Xbox, and how much longer would it actually take for somebody to do those things? If we take a look at the actual front of the GameCube here, obviously it looks very similar to Nintendo 64, but that is where the similarities end. These are completely different on the architecture front. The only thing these two things have in common is the name Nintendo on the actual console in and of itself. Now this is going to be running at 486 megahertz on a PowerPC CPU, so to say that is more powerful than the CPU in the Nintendo 64 would be an understatement. This is exponentially beefier and more powerful than anything Nintendo 64 ever had on board. Now this is a cut down and pivoted version of some of the processors you would see in the Power Max and iMacs on the G3 side of things. If you're an Apple consumer back in the day like I was, you were basically using what amounted to a cut down Apple processor from IBM within the GameCube, and you'll see here it adds 50 new instruction sets as well as a modified FPU or floating point unit. Basically, this processor is generations ahead of what was in the Nintendo 64. For an FPGA to have enough logic on it to be able to fit even something like this, at this point in time, you're talking about a product that is going to cost about the same as a late model used Honda Civic. We're not talking about the $230 on the DE10 Nano board. We're talking about adding digits and getting high up there to the point where you could almost buy a vehicle. And we're just talking about the complexity and fit of this within an FPGA at this point in time. There's a lot more that goes into it than just that. And on the graphic side of things, we have an ATI flipper that was designed by Ardex, and maybe I'll do a video in the future to tell you why this was supposed to be the 3DO M3. Leave me a comment down below and tell me if you're interested. But the entire point I'm trying to get at here is that this is a massively complicated system compared to the Nintendo 64 just because of how much time and technology elapsed between the development of the Nintendo 64 and of the GameCube in and of itself. Robert was able to make a Nintendo 64 core in a year as one individual. Really, the issue with this is not just the pricing of the FPGAs and waiting for the technology to come down, it's the amount of man hours that would be required to actually do something like this. Because even though Nintendo 64 can look amazing in motion in some of the later games, it is something that one human being can achieve within a year. If you talked about an FPGA device that was available today that could recreate an entire Nintendo 64, you're probably talking about a team of 5 to 10 people working multiple years in a row to be able to do a core like this, who has got the time and more importantly, who has the money. Because the Nintendo 64 took 1 year of active development from Robert. If you kind of extrapolate that with the complexity of the GameCube and talk about how long that would take one person to make, you might be into the 4 to 5 year mark. Let's take a look at Sega Saturn. Obviously, again, I said that's been 2 years in development. So if you think about how much more complex a GameCube or an Xbox or a PlayStation 2 is, you do the math. Because you think about the Nintendo 64, that's based upon technology available and developed in 1995. And if you think about the 90s, in 1990, we're still playing the NES. By the end of the decade, 1999, you were into the Dreamcast lifespan, and that is a big difference. The GameCube was developed basically in the year 2000, so think of all the technological advancements and think about how complex the system's going to get in the intervening 5 years of technology moving forward. Even on the CPU side of things, you have the NEC VR4300 running at 93 megahertz, and the clock speed of these chips is going to fundamentally matter in an FPGA in the future. We move back over to the GameCube side of things, and now you have that 486 megahertz PowerPC chip. It is levels of complex compared to the Nintendo 64 CPU, and it is running incredibly faster by comparison. Let's take a look at the PlayStation 2, the weakest of the three systems as far as specs are concerned. This was developed basically on hardware that was available around 1998, and obviously it's still well beyond what the PlayStation 1 could do. On the CPU side of things, you are running at 294 megahertz, so we have basically almost a 200 megahertz decrease on the PowerPC chip that would be on GameCube, so this is getting more in the realms of potentially achievable. But even on the graphic synthesizer side, you still have a very complex chip. This is still, again, the type of system that if one person sat down and tried to recreate it in FPGA, you're probably talking 3-4 years of active development. And again, people have lives. I don't think there's any FPGA developer who's making his entire career off doing these things outside of maybe Hotego. It is a time thing. And the other question is this something that even really needs to be done? You can make your decision based upon how you feel, but PCSX2 does an incredible job of being a PlayStation 2, and it provides so many visual enhancements. You can get something running basically at the native resolution, or you can scale it all the way up to 4K. Those are things that would require an FPGA that would probably be closer to the price of a new vehicle these days. And having all of these different enhancements, the emulation side of things for PlayStation 2, GameCube, and Xbox are so incredibly good that the question really is that where people want to focus their time developing FPGA cores for? I can't really answer that question. You have to answer it for yourself, and the core developers would have to answer it as well. But if we take a look at something again like GameCube emulation here on Dolphin, it is amazing. It does so many incredible things, and if you want real GameCube hardware, you can pick one up for like $70 at this point in time. But let's talk about the elephant in the room, the Sega Dreamcast, because the MARS FPGA team has said they're bringing an FPGA core to this. Now what I want you to realize is the Dreamcast is a very pretty system, but it has more in a relationship to something like Nintendo 64, PlayStation 1, and Sega Saturn than it does GameCube, PlayStation 2, or Xbox. That's just to say that because this came out in 1998, in Japan, it's developed on hardware that is closer in complexity than something like the GameCube. If we take a look under the hood here as well, we're talking about technology that kind of evolved and was developed between 1996 and 1997. And in the 90s, even a year made a big difference, but this becomes more potentially achievable on something that would reach the quote-unquote consumer level FPGA price and complexity. MARS FPGA says this is going to be a $700 board. We haven't seen Dreamcast running on it yet, but if it does, that would be nice to see. But again, the question is, do we really need that? A Dreamcast with an optical disc emulator and an HDMI mod out the back is like $350. And let's not even bother talking about something like Xbox. This has a CPU, a Pentium 3, running in the 700 megahertz range. The type of FPGA that would be required to get an entire Xbox running inside of it is probably going to be the price on a PCI card looking at Jurassic Site right now. Maybe a used BMW 3 Series with some decent miles on it, but nothing too crazy. The entire point I'm trying to make is everyone keeps asking when GameCube, PlayStation 2, and Xbox are going to see FPGA cores, and if we ever see them, we're probably talking about another decade. If I'm still doing this channel in 2034, maybe I'll be talking about them then, but the GameCube, the PlayStation 2, and the Xbox are such a gigantic generational leap over PlayStation 1, Nintendo 64, Sega Saturn, and even Dreamcast. I want you guys to be aware that this is not something you're going to see in 24 or 36 months, and even if the hardware is there anybody that can spend the amount of time to actually make it happen? If you have any questions, leave them down below, but we're done. Bye-bye.